Hi, folks. In this episode, we're going to be talking about how to identify other people's personality types. And this is a skill you should use carefully and judiciously, as you'll see. But once you get to know your own Myers-Briggs type, it's something that can help you to communicate more effectively with others just by a few simple observations. Mark and I are going to break it down for you and bring you a more thorough understanding of the tool. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome to the new Myers-Briggs Question Corner. I'm Edith Richards.
And I'm Mark Matthew.
And we're here to answer your questions about all things personality and all things Myers-Briggs.
From college to careers to relationships, personality is the key to finding the right fit.
Hi, everyone, and hi, Mark. We've got a really good discussion today about identifying other people's Myers-Briggs types. And once people get a general understanding of the MBTI, it's natural to become curious about their friends and family's types. So we're going to get into if and how we should go about identifying someone else's type. And I'm really excited to talk about this.
Yeah, Edith, I'm really looking forward to this episode. How do we identify other people's personalities? I know there's a lot of resources people can use to determine their own personality, but can I really identify another's personality just by observing them and looking at them? I don't know, but it'd be wild if we could possibly do that. If I can just see somebody and just know, oh boy, that's an extrovert. Oh boy, that's a sensor. It'd be awesome to be able to do so. I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to talk about that. And as a MBTI master practitioner, I just wanted to ask you, Edith, is it possible to identify other people's personality just by observing them?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but let me say this. It's impossible to determine someone else's what we call true type just by observing them, unless, of course, they've verified it for themselves. And what we're talking about here is called typecasting. And this is making assumptions on what other people's personality types are. And I'll just say that everyone who has a certain level of expertise with the Myers-Briggs does this. We sort of make these parlor games out of what the MBTI is and what different people's types are and try to figure out what personality types various people are. But here's the deal. We shouldn't assume that we get it right. There's so much more that goes into someone's personality than the Myers-Briggs measures. And a lot of the time, people like myself, and I'm going to include myself when I say this, we're first only going by observation. We don't always know if someone is behaving a certain way because they've learned to do so for whatever reason. So quick example, they may show up as being very talkative and outward focused and interacting with a lot of people. So we may assume this person is an extrovert, when in fact, this person is an introvert who has honed his or her extroversion. And Mark, you've talked about doing this yourself, so much so that a lot of people assume, wrongly so, that you're an extrovert.
Yeah, it happens to me all the time. Everybody always mistakes me for an extrovert when I'm like a really, really deep introvert. So I understand what you're saying about, kind of faking it and honing your skill on something that might be different. I get that.
Yeah. And the other danger with typecasting is our own confirmation bias. We may assume, for whatever reason, that the reason someone is behaving a certain way is because of their personality. But we've already mentioned that personality isn't one nice, neat package that's easily measured. But we're human, and that's what we do. We make judgments based on our own set of beliefs. So we really have to be careful. Just because someone is aloof and uncooperative, for example, doesn't mean that they're an introverted type or a thinking type or whatever. The only way to accurately know what someone's Myers-Briggs type is for them to verify it themselves.
Well, that's true. And so, like, you're kind of saying that by observing and examining somebody's behavior, we may be able to identify their preference, but we should be careful in our assessment, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's kind of reminds me a little bit like, if I might see an individual, and I'll mention this a couple times for myself. I might see an individual multiple times at Denny's. We might make eye contact. We're both working on something. I might be on the computer. They might be reading on their own. I can probably bet their preference is an introvert, but I can't say definitively that's the case. But I could probably guess that that might be what their preference might be.
Yeah, maybe. But with that said, I don't know a lot of extroverts who go into a restaurant by themselves multiple times to work on their computers. Again, who knows without talking to them and having them verify that for themselves.
No question. I mean, we do love your ability and giving you the power to observe people, but it doesn't stop you from getting to know people. Like, getting to know people is the key in order to figure out people's type, not necessarily just looking at and observing people. And I'm glad you really mentioned that. I think that's awesome that you mentioned that.
Yeah, yeah, it's something we've got to be careful of. So
Yeah. So I'm ready. I'm ready for this. Why don't we do this? Why don't we take a deep dive into the four preference categories to give our audience a thorough understanding of each preference type so they can identify their friends, spouses, moms, dads, bosses, personality types. I think that could be really cool to give our audience the superpower of being able to identify personality typings a little bit. What do you think about that?
yeah, let's do it. Quick review would be great. And I'm going to mention some behaviors or characteristics to be on the lookout for if you do want to try to type someone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think since we've spoken, I've been able to observe people, and this is people that I know, right? So, like, it's great to be able to know an individual and have their behaviors verify that for you, right? So, like, it's good to be able to observe the behavior and go, yeah, I knew that person was an extrovert. I've had conversations, but now that I'm observing their behaviors, it's almost like it verifies to them that they're an extrovert or they're a judger because I see they got their planners out. They've
Hmm.
got their to-do list on, like that
Hmm.
verified that that person is a judger. So I love our ability to talk about behaviors and to do that. So let's start with our first one. Let's talk about the preference of introversion and extroversion. What kind of behaviors do individuals in each group display?
Okay, this is probably the easiest one of the four dichotomies to observe. So let's start with extroverts. So they do their thinking while they're talking. So it's like a talk, think, talk. And this is an easy way to spot an extroverted type. They may read through an email out loud, for example, or they may comment on it, not to any other person, but to themselves. So they're not necessarily talking to anyone, but they're solving their problems by talking things out loud. And they do like to talk to others too, of course. Thinking out loud and verbalizing it is how they process and reflect on their thoughts. They like to be around a lot of different types of people. And this is very common for extroverted types. They have a lot of diversity in their friend groups. So they're often seen as approachable. Since they enjoy interacting with others, they tend to be more open to communicating with strangers. They may get bored if they're alone.
Hmm.
They may also enjoy hosting social gatherings. They may interact a lot on social media, and they may pay attention to this one. In emails, do they use a lot of exclamation points? Not just a couple, but regularly. That's my cue that this person might be an extroverted type.
That's funny. I really haven't even put a lot of thought in that, but I definitely don't use exclamation points in my email. So that's maybe a reason why I might be an introvert.
Yeah, that's something that more extroverts than introverts tend to do. So I pay attention to that a lot because I get a lot of emails and I use that in work a lot. So that's something I pay attention to. But okay, here's some signs someone may be an introverted type. People may think that introverts are always quiet, but this isn't always the case, and context is key here. Introverted types tend to be quite chatty in situations where they feel comfortable or with issues that they're passionate about. They're still reflective and observant, and they do tend to think before speaking. This is why introverted types may pause or even freeze if they're called upon suddenly in like a meeting or in class. Yeah, they're more comfortable in one-on-one settings or in smaller groups than large groups. They forge strong connections with people and prefer talking in depth on subjects that interest them rather than having, that small talk conversation in large groups or with a bunch of strangers. So another way to spot an introverted type is to watch what seems to exhaust them. Introverted types tend to get drained from a lot of social interaction, and they need quiet time to recharge. But it's important to note that many introverts will display more extroverted qualities when they feel comfortable.
Yeah, no question about that. It's almost like when they feel comfortable, they may display extroverted personality behavior, right? So I think that's really good. And one of the things I want to do real quick, Edith, and I think you did a wonderful job in presenting the behaviors. And one of the things that I am, as far as my personality type, as far as an intuitive, I always like to kind of create like a level of conclusions to what I think this is all about, because it helps me kind of move on from it once I've figured it out, right? And so I'm going to just present a couple of things that I feel like concludes, like some conclusions to each particular preference type. And then you as an MBTI, master practitioner, just help, like, because I'm trying to get to still figure this out, kind of walk me through that. And, if you don't think it's the right thing, let me know, but I'm trying to kind of still figure it out. So one of the things that I see with extroverts is that they like a breadth of experiences. They like to experience a lot. Like many experiences energize them, and introverts, the depth of experiences, their ability to process things is kind of where they gain energy from. What do you think about that?
Yep, definitely. With extroverts, it's more about breadth. With introverts, it's more about depth. Yep.
Yeah, and I think that's where I struggle, right? Like I struggle with the idea where when I get too many experiences, it makes it hard for me to process it. So I get very, very tired, and sometimes it makes me want to leave. And that's why I do leave, is because I do want to process it. And when I'm getting information points from all over the place, it just becomes overwhelming.
Yeah.
I could definitely see that.
Yeah.
All right.
And for me, like if I have too much depth, it kind of becomes boring. So I want to move on to a different topic.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of every conversation I have with everybody. Matter of fact, when I talk to people, I say, "Hey, do you want to put on your scuba gear? Like, because I'm going to get deep with this thing." And most people are like, "Nah, I'm good. I'm good to stay here in the shallow end." So I can definitely see that. And then maybe that's the way I can determine if I'm talking to a extrovert. All right. So here's another one. Extroverts work like a scanner. They're constantly scanning their environment. Introverts are like vacuums, pulling things up and processing them as they encounter them. Would that be a good little analogy?
I'm trying to think here. So extroverts as like scanning their environment. I mean, I don't know. I can't speak for other extroverts, but for myself, yeah, that's somewhat true, because I'm kind of, at least for me, I'm looking for the next new experience, I guess.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like kind of like, well, like those scanner type things at the beach, like when you kind of like go around and it's scanning for like go, and it's like going all over the place, beeping a little bit. Like that's kind of what you're not like an actual like print scanner, but like an actual like just scanning different things, like at the grocery store when you're just scanning different items throughout. Like sometimes I feel like that's kind of like our extroverts with that, because I think they're always trying to seek an experience, right? And so they're always trying to seek out new experiences, and that kind of charges them up. And I think that the introverts, I would say, just from a conclusion, they're always processing and trying to understand things in general. Like that's kind of like what energizes them.
Yep, I can totally see that. Yep.
All right, I think you might like this one because I think you mentioned this a couple times. I said
Mm,
introverts present fully formed ideas, which is like what I do. Like if you ever see me in my text message, it's like a complete
mhm.
it's a complete like paragraph. It's like a book, right? And then extroverts present half-baked ideas.
Yeah, it could be. But this also goes, I think, to the last dichotomy of J and P as well. So I think that could be a little bit of both there.
Okay. No
Yeah.
doubt. No
Yeah,
doubt.
yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Cool, cool, cool. So I like that discussion that we had on our first preference. Okay. Our second preference. Let's talk about sensing and intuition.
Okay, so deep dive into this one. Sensing and intuition is based on our preferred way of perceiving or gathering information. So for this one, pay attention to someone's communication style, and you can ask them to describe something or someone, anything. It can be an apple or a picture or a person. So to spot a sensing type, they're going to focus on concrete details, and they're going to use their five senses. They're going to use very concrete and specific language. So let's take the apple. So this apple is red. It has a small stem. It doesn't look completely ripe. It's not completely smooth. One side is bruised. It smells fresh and it tastes good. It's curved at a 90-degree angle. One side is larger than the other. So they're going to rely on their past experiences and real world data. They're focused on the sensory experience, whatever they can see, hear, taste, touch, and smell. So that's a sensor. Intuitives are going to focus on abstract concepts, ideas, and connections. They're going to rely on their imagination, and they may be comfortable with ambiguity. So let's go back to the apple example. So an intuitive type might start out describing what they see, but pretty soon they're going to start wandering off and talking about their ideas. They might even make it into a story like, oh, this apple has made a long journey. It began its life as a seed and it was thrown into this desolate field by a poor young girl who was eating its parent while she was walking to her friend's house one fall evening. Or, or this apple reminds me of one that I ate last week and it wasn't nearly as delicious as this one. Or I could use this apple to make an apple pie or a salad. And in fact, my mom loves apples. And that reminds me, I need to go to the grocery store to buy fruit. so,
Yeah, yeah,
so,
that
so
sounds like how I tell stories.
yeah. Well, me too. And I mean, this is an intuitive person's kind of thought process. It doesn't go in this nice, neat, linear kind of step-by-step fashion. And it's always, making connections, and they may have metaphors or different stories that come into this when they're explaining something.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me how easy it is for sensors and intuitives to like really misunderstand each other. Like they're really looking at the same thing, but they're describing it completely different. So I can see how they can, get either this deer in headlights look with each other, like as
Yep.
they're talking or
Yep.
going over stories, or maybe getting bored, with each other as they're kind of discussing certain things and certain topics. So yeah, I definitely want to like dig really deep into this thing too, right? And just kind of take a look at some of the stuff. I think a large part of this is based on details. Like when you start discussing the details, like you lose me. Like I am not focused on it because there's so many other things that are way more important than the details. For me, it's the comparisons, it's the possibilities, what can happen, and
Mhm.
the analogies, like breaking down the story where it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Like, what did we really learn? I mean, I guess we did learn about the story, but how can we how can we make things more possible? Like you didn't tell me what can happen, what can be, right? And I think that's kind of where we get stuck, where the sensors are really focused in the information, and because they really, really, really like the details, and sometimes the intuitives are just very, very bored with the details.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep, I have that myself too. Like if I'm talking to somebody and they're really getting into the minutia of, how this motor is put together, and they just start explaining it. Well, if you want to fix a motor, you first you do this and this, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I mean, my eyes just start glazing over because it's like, okay, what's the point?
Yeah. And but we know details matter, right? And so like we know it's really, really important because details do matter. Like one of the big things I've always tell my players is, it's all about the little things. All the little things make up the big picture. So although I'm very big picture
True.
oriented, I'm so pleased to be able to work with so many sensors because they help kind of rein me in. Do you feel that like sometimes the sensors kind of pull you back to earth, with like sometimes we tend to be going kind of off the kind of
Yes.
like outer
Yes.
world, and they kind of bring you
Yes.
back in. Do you feel that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like I can totally go off into la la land regularly, and I need a sensor to bring me back to reality. Okay, focus, focus, focus. So I gotta love my sensors out there for sure.
Yeah. The breakdown, because I know this is something that I feel like sensors and intuitives are always different.
Mhm.
Stories. Break down how an intuitive would tell a story. I know you kind of talked about that when you're describing the apple, right? And how a sensor would tell a story of like, how was your vacation? Like,
Mhm.
how would both individuals talk about their experience?
Right. So a sensor is, yeah, they will very likely get mired into the details. They're going to go into the past and recount it, first this, and then this, and then this, and it's going to be really linear. And intuitives, if we remember, they're focused on the big picture, they're focused on connections and meanings. So they might talk about, how we felt or what I learned, or, something that is not immediately apparent to the five senses. They're going to be focused on that sixth sense, that intuition. And so they might see skipping all over the place. And, this can be, of course, confusing to sensing types because they want to follow this sequential pattern of information and how to do things. And they don't always follow the intuitive's brain when it goes off into all of these tangents and things like that. So it can really, like you said, it can be very easy for these two types to misunderstand each other.
Especially in relationships, right? The big question of how was your day can be really, really difficult if you're in a different preference in this area because how your day for a sensor might be like, well, like I'm going to go through what happened at 7 o'clock and work all your way
Mhm.
down. And my thing is like, yeah, but what were the big things that occurred? Like, what was the
Mhm.
things that occurred? And I know that when I talk about my day, I know the sensors are very frustrated because I'm all over the place. Like I am
Mhm.
constantly jumping from areas that I deem that's important, right?
Mhm.
To be able to get done. So, one of the things I wanted to kind of look at too, right? As we kind of focus a little bit and take even a deeper dive, and you kind of tell me if this is true or not. So, obviously, we talked about sensors are into facts, details, and what is, right? And intuitives are interested in theories, possibility, alternatives, focusing on the future, what can work, what can be, and what else can be done, right? Like the possibilities of that, right? And so sensors they want to choose things that are proven and that has worked because those things are grounded in facts and details, right? These are
Mhm.
things that are there. Let's just get this done is kind of like their idea. Like so if you wanted to come up with a project for your house, like you're working together, they just want to get this stuff done. And then what's the best way to get it done, right? Intuitives, on the other hand, are always thinking that there might be a better way to kind of get things done. And so they might look into exploring different ways, but it may not lead to them getting it done right now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, when I'm thinking about the house thing here, and what I'm thinking about is, okay, well, what are the possibilities if we take out this wall and we do these things? Oh, this might be really cool. If we do this, then we'll have more
Yeah.
space and we can do this and this and this. When the sensor, again, they're going to be grounded in reality. So they're going to be looking at, well, first, in order to do this, we have to take a look at this structure, and we have to take a look at the materials here. And so that's what their focus is going to be. It's going to be more on the details of maybe the engineering, or is this possible? Is this realistic here? So Again, we both need each other though, because the sensing types are not always naturally going to see these possibilities. They're not going to see these innovative new ideas here.
Yeah.
And we intuitives might not be focused on the reality that, hey, if we take out this wall, this plumbing is going to
Yeah.
not work here in this house. So again, you can see where we each need each other.
It's a great point. I mean, I think this might actually be a great place where we talk about opposites attract, right? Because really, the sensing and intuitive preference is really about how we see the world, right? And that sort of stuff. And so, so when we're dealing with a problem, we do need to have people that can see the possibilities. Because how do we move? Like, how do we advance? How do we progress if we don't have those sorts of people? But then, how do we not? But in order for it to get it done, we need the details in order to get those things accomplished. So I think it's important when we're in different groups that we give time for people with details, right? And we give time for people with like the intuitives, because a lot of times I feel like our intuitives don't necessarily get that time to talk about the possibilities that we can kind of solve a lot of our problems, right? And get a lot of things accomplished if we kind of work together based on the different preferences that we have.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't know, for me, I'm always attracted to people who have these qualities that I myself don't have. I think we mentioned in a previous episode that it's easy to connect with like-minded people, right? But
Mm.
one of the greatest opportunities to learn is by really sitting down and connecting with somebody who's very different from you and trying to see a different perspective. And if we could all do this a little bit more, just imagine all of the great solutions that we can come up with.
And that's really what it's all about, right? It's creating those solutions in life. So no question. I really loved how we kind of, kind of went on a deep dive on that preference, because I do think sometimes this preference can be overlooked, but I think it's something that's very plays a huge role and an important essential role in how we live our lives and how we solve our problems.
Oh, yeah, no worries. To me, this is such an important one. This is such an important dichotomy because I always think this is where communication really starts happening here. And intuitives, because we are only about a quarter of the population.
Mm.
Largely, the world at large is sensing types. And so at least I myself have, I've tried very hard to hone my sensing preference. And, I can tell you it's really not easy. But yeah, I like that deep dive into that preference too, Mark.
And I love what you said there. Like you mentioned this earlier with my ability to be an extrovert when I need to, or like the idea that when I feel comfortable, I become more extroverted, right? And I think it's
Mhm.
the same thing here. If the project is important to me, I'm all in the details. Like I'm going to be a sensor, like over sensor. And so like I totally agree with what you're saying is like when you're in a situation, for me as an introvert, it's a situation where I feel comfortable, I'm going to display extroverted behaviors. And when I'm in a situation where I think something's important, I'm going to display sensing behaviors. And so it's really, really important to understand that too. So I love the point that you made about that earlier.
Yeah. And again, it's about we all have the ability. We all have the ability to do this. So, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's move on to the old thinking and feeling preference.
Okay. Thinking and feeling. All right. So, this is how we make decisions, right? Thinkers are logic based. They're interested in things that require logistical or strategic thinking, like science and math, computers, business, engineering, even philosophy. So, calculations play an important role in the way that thinkers think. They notice logical inconsistencies, like when numbers don't add up or when someone doesn't make logical sense. They need things to make sense and they need things to be clear and they need to have evidence for such. And their feelings may take a back seat in their consciousness. So sometimes they can be perceived as either emotionally distant or detached. And in fact, they can struggle to process emotions because they're used to being able to explain things logically. They may not factor other people's emotions in when they make decisions because they're so focused on a logical outcome. They also tend to value honesty over tact. And as a result, they can be pretty direct. They want to speak the truth, even if it's not what people want to hear. So that's thinking types. Feeling types tend to be more aware of their emotions, both their own and the emotions of the people around them. They want to make decisions that are going to bring the most peace and harmony. And they can pick up on subtle cues around them that may not be obvious to other people. I think feeling types tend to have an innate ability to empathize with others. They tend to be good at reading people, and they believe that emotions, both their own and other people's, are an important part of the decision-making process. And so as a result, they take emotions into account when they make decisions. And they know that speaking the truth can hurt people, and sometimes it can even be harmful. So feeling types do strive for diplomacy. They try to find a balance between hurting people and being truthful. And one of the things that feeling types can get knocked on is for being too idealistic. We may be disappointed when the world doesn't live up to our expectations. I say we here because as our listeners know, both Mark and I are feeling types. And we are drawn to helping professions. And I think we excel in these roles because of our people skills and our natural way of motivating other people.
It is. Could you give me an example of how like a thinker and a feeler might approach a decision differently?
Yeah. Okay. So let's take a look at deciding on whether to take a new job. All right. So a thinking type might look at the differences in salary, position, maybe even future career opportunities, especially if they're an intuitive type. While a feeling type might be more apt to look at group dynamics and how harmonious the team will be. And business ideas. So thinking types might analyze all aspects of the markets and business models, while feeling types are going to consider how personally motivated they feel about each idea is. So the point here is not there's right or wrong. In a nutshell, thinking types provide logic and a pragmatic viewpoint, while feeling types provide empathy and people dynamics, and both are important in any decision.
No question. And I think just as you were talking, just to conclude a little bit about this particular preference, I feel like thinkers want the best decision and feelers are looking for the right decision for everybody. So if you take a look at kind of what drives people, feelers are looking for harmony. Harmony is what fuels the feeler. The thinkers are looking for the best results as far as what drives them, right? And I think because of that, that's why you have the emotional appeal, right? It's not like individuals are incapable of these different emotions, but because one is striving for the best decision, right, and the other one's striving for harmony, it leads to these different type of emotional things. So, like if you take a look at it, because thinkers aren't looking for harmony, they're looking for what's best. Their feelings aren't easily hurt, and they don't easily recognize the hurt in others, right? But if you take a look at it, somebody who's a feeler like you and I are, that desires harmony, they can become easily frustrated, right? Easily hurt and confused by the words and the actions of the thinkers when they disagree. So I can see why what we're looking for fuels the emotions that are behind it.
I think it can be summed up in results or people, results over people or people over results, right? And a lot of the times what I hear, I think in the business world is they're just driving towards results. And if we stop and the feeling type is going to, well, at what's the consequence of getting the results? Yeah, we know that the results here are important, but is it important to the expense of people's well-being or the group dynamics or overworking people, for example.
Well, yeah, no question. Well said. Well said. Let's move on to our last preference, and this one's this is big because maybe I'm saying it's big because I don't find a lot of perceiving friends. Like all my friends are very much judging friends. But our last preference category: judging versus perceiving.
Okay, so this relates to how we live our life, how we deal with the external world. So judging types tend to be organized and decisive. They want to have a plan and they want to stick with it. They want a sense of closure and they want order in their lives. Perceiving types tend to be more open-minded and adaptable. They like to keep their options open and they aren't as concerned with sticking to a plan or a schedule. So an easy way to spot a judging type is that they enjoy making lists and they find lists useful. They like to check things off their list, either physically on paper or mentally. We hear about a lot of people having like a mental checklist. Perceivers don't really like lists. They may find deadlines overly stifling and restrictive. And I would say regarding lists, most perceiving types are not natural list makers. They may want a deadline to be extended, for example. They may not like to plan ahead too much because you never know what tomorrow is going to bring. We perceiving types like to go with the flow and be spontaneous, and we may delay things for sure. And I heard you, Mark, you said that you seem to be the lone perceiver in like your group of friends. So how does that play out for you?
I mean, the major thing I think this is really important for perceivers. It doesn't really matter to me because part of the reason why I'm waiting is because I want to come up with the best option, right? And I think it kind of goes to like a quote that I've always kind of used to kind of do that. I love judges because they're productive and they're productive for productive sakes, right? And I think sometimes a perceiver, like here's what a quote that I live by is, don't mistake activity for achievement. Not because you're doing something means you're actually doing something. Like I value production, but I don't value just activity for activity's sake. And I think at times, and I could be broad brushing, right? I think at times judges are doing things because they just want to be productive versus I think like, what is that actual activity doing to the bigger picture of design? What is that action doing for what the overall big picture is and what we're trying to look for? And I think sometimes perceivers are trying to wait for all the options, right? Because they want to have options so that way they can figure out what the best choice is, not necessarily another
Yes.
choice, right? And I think that's
Yes.
kind of where I am with it.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that too. I mean, it might look like I'm delaying a decision as a perceiver myself, delaying a decision, but I'm trying to think of, just factor everything in and trying to come up with the best decision for me at this time.
Yeah. And like, look, as we talked about, I need them, right? Because
Mhm.
their closure and having things allows me to say, stop, it's time to make a decision. Like we need to be productive. And I need that, right? And the fact that they're so productive based, that's why when I choose a group, I'm choosing, I'm choosing judges. Like I'm not choosing another perceiver. Like if I'm choosing a group for like a college project, I want to make sure that I have a lot of judges in that group because they're always going to strive to be productive, right? And so they'll use me for the ability to try to figure out what the best idea is, right? But it's always great to have a judge in my group because they're always going to make sure that we're not only are we productive, but we're timely as well. So I really appreciate them.
And I think one area that judges can improve upon, though, I'm with you, Mark. I appreciate my judging friends so much because they keep me on track here. But they do often have this list of things that they need to follow, and they have to check things off their list, and they are not going to get diverted from their lists. Whereas for me, I can divert from the list and I can do this thing over here if it needs to get done. I can do this other thing over this way that needs to get done. But a lot of the time, judging types are so singularly focused on this one goal that they close themselves off to other possibilities, and as such may not be able to do all of the things that they might otherwise do if they weren't so singularly focused, if that makes sense.
No question. I think a lot of times you can tell a judger based off of their to-do list and then their inability to not move on or to what I call chill, right? To relax
Yeah,
until
yeah.
all those things are done, right? Versus a perceiver can chill at any moment in time. Like, okay, this seems like a perfect opportunity. It's really harder for somebody who's a judging personality type to really relax before they have a significant amount of stuff crossed off their list.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and the focus there, so they can come across as, inflexible as a result. But then on the other hand, they're going to see us as too like
Yeah,
loosey goosey or
laser
whatever.
fair, laser
Yeah,
fair. Yeah, just
right, for
don't
sure.
want to get anything accomplished. Look at your
Yeah.
car; it's so filthy, right? Like, I get it.
Yep. So again, easy to see where these misunderstandings can turn up here.
Okay, so I want to play a game. I think this might be really, really interesting, right? Because the whole idea is can we identify different preferences and different essentially personality types in other people? So if I'm going to put you on the spot, right, and we're going to do a test. Can you identify the personality preferences of our last three presidents? Barack Obama, Donald J. Trump, and Joe Biden.
Okay, this is going to be hard because let me say a disclaimer here. I have my own viewpoints on this and I might be wrong. I mean, especially when it comes to like famous people, it is really difficult to type famous people. And I think especially presidents and politicians. So this is not easy for me. So I'm just going to share what I thought, what I think. And let me start with Obama because he's a very interesting case for me. Like anybody who is in the world of Myers-Briggs, like we try to type everybody, right? And we shouldn't really be doing this because it says a lot more about us than it does them. And our biases are definitely a fact in this. But with that said, okay, let me start with him. Again, I think he is of the three. So of our last three presidents, for me, he's the hardest one. He is the hardest one to determine. And I have my initial read on him. My initial read was that he's an ENFJ. And the reason for that is when he's talking to people, he tends to pause to understand who these people are and what they're focused on. He's naturally like an affable kind of guy. He's charismatic. And to me, he's focused on people. And that's why I think he's both a feeling type and an extrovert. He seems idealistic to me. He seems like he's concerned about other people in the world around him. And, I think he does speak up for what's right, what he thinks is right, even though it's hard. But when he does that, he doesn't come across as brash or pushy. And ENFJ types are natural leaders, but when I've looked him up, and in all fairness, I did look him up here. I've looked him up before because just when, I'm curious about somebody, I want to know what their Myers-Briggs type is. But there's a lot of people have described him as other types, especially like an ENTP. I've heard him typed as an ENFP. And, I think there can be cases made for those types as well. One thing, especially I think with politicians, we need to remember is that they do use their non-preferred functions because they have to appeal to a wide variety of constituents. And so it may often appear that they're well developed in all areas and all four of the dichotomies. So a couple things I want to mention here. One, I'm trying very hard to be aware of my own biases here. And another thing, any person may be one way on camera, but they may be completely different behind closed doors. And, a lot of Obama's life before he came into public office is unknown. So it's really hard for me to type Obama. He could also be an introvert too, Mark. I mean, I know at some point we're going to be talking about cognitive functions, which take a way deeper dive into the Myers-Briggs. So maybe we can bring this conversation up again at that point, because I think it can help our listener friends who are interested in this and the deeper aspect of personality.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that's my thought on Obama. Donald Trump. So he's the easiest one for me to type. But again, disclaimer here, I can be wrong. My first thought of him is he's an ESTP. And the reason for this, ESTPs, they're natural salesmen, they're natural negotiators, and they are completely in the moment. They live life in the fast lane. They thrive on action and doing things. And Trump's focus is very much on the outer world, and this fuels his energy. I mean, we think about, his rallies and his speeches. He doesn't like it when there's only a few people who are there at his rallies. He's very focused on the number of people who attend. And, you can see him like turning up charm when he needs to. So I'm going to say his extroversion is pretty off the scale. He's pretty extroverted. Sensing. I think he's a sensor because he is all about flashy stuff. He's about luxury and money. And you look at all of his buildings, the gold in all of his buildings. It just screams like luxury and wealth. And he's very much in the moment, which is typical of sensing types. He doesn't talk too much about future plans or any kind of abstract concepts, anything like that. Thinking and feeling. So this one might be a little bit more tough for me because I think there can be a case made for Trump actually being a feeler, but, a very undeveloped feeler. He has this persona of being tough and aggressive, which is initially why I would think that he's a thinking type. He doesn't seem to be too much in touch with his own or other people's emotions. But at the same time, he's also highly manipulative and he exploits people. And, I think there can be a case made for him being sensitive too. And these are signs of a feeler. And this is the dark side of feeling. And I think we may have mentioned this previously. When a feeler gets hurt, they can lash out. They want you to feel their pain. So I'm on the fence about this, whether he's a thinker or a feeling type. I don't know much about Trump's life growing up, but if I'm remembering correctly, his father was a very tough businessman too. And his father or his family dynamics could have colored who he is and who he's become. And then, so I move on to the fourth dichotomy, J and P. So Trump's impulsive. He's had a lot of failures in his businesses because he didn't think things through. If you watch him, he is very quick to adapt to his environment in a way that favors him. So even when he's giving an interview, he doesn't always follow a plan. He can veer off in very different directions very quickly. So this is why I'm thinking he is a perceiving type. So I want to point out here, though, that there are healthy and unhealthy versions of every type. Whatever Donald Trump's personality type is, whether he's an ESTP or an ESFP, he's motivated by power and success, how he defines success to be. And he uses his personality to get what he wants.
Wow, Edith, I think you really nailed both Barack and Donald, President Obama and President Trump. I don't know these guys on the individual level. She'll be calling them by their last names. All right. So our last one, President Joe Biden.
Okay. Good old Joe Biden. This one, he is really hard for me as well. And, again, if I could, I don't know these people either. And if I could sit down with them and just talk to them and ask them questions, I'd like to think I could have a better understanding of them. But since I'm not able to do that, I have to go with like my first guess or my best guess of Joe. And I'd have to say it's either an ESFJ, maybe an ENFJ. But I could also say he could be an ESFP, possibly. Could be a thinker as well. So again, it's hard for me to say. I am going to say he's an extrovert because he does seem to enjoy being around people. I am going to say most likely he's a feeling type because he seems to, he wants to check in on people and how other people are doing. And he does seem to be aware of other people's needs. He does try to get group consensus before he acts on things. And I think he does try to smooth things over a lot when people don't feel good about a decision. So to me, he seems like a people pleaser. So that's why I say probably a feeler. I want to say he might be an S, a sensing type, because I get the sense that he tends to be like practical and realistic. He doesn't seem to have a lot of really lengthy conversations about abstract concepts, but at the same time, he could be doing what a lot of politicians do to appease his constituents. He does seem to be focused on future implications. And I'm not sure if that's natural or if that's like learned behavior. I don't really know. So that's tough to determine for me. The last dichotomy, J or P, again, I'm going to just speak to my own bias again, but I think it's harder for a perceiving type to be as organized and time conscious as you need to be successful in a political role. J's or judging types tend to be directive. They tell people what to do. They know what they want to see happen. They want to be in control. So this isn't to say that a P can't be a good leader, but I tend to think that we perceiving types might see leadership more like a sailboat, like we adjust our sails accordingly and we kind of flow with the wind. And that can be hard to do if you're talking about being president or being in an executive role like Joe Biden is.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Audience, can we give Edith a round of applause? I mean, wow. I mean, her ability to, again, you don't want to typecast. Like, we don't know these individuals. That's something that we talked about earlier. But to be able to see the behaviors and to be able to say probably those behaviors show this type of preference, I think is where we really, really want the audience, right? We don't want people to say, well, you're definitely this, because that means that you have to get to know them and know what's going on in their lives and see, are they faking it? Are they using this to please their constituents? That sort of stuff. But can you identify the behaviors to the preference is kind of where you really, really want to be. Edith, you crushed this episode. You really helped us understand how to identify personality types and preferences through observational data. I think this episode was so informative, and I hope our audience gets a chance to not only learn how to identify an individual's personality type, but also identify their own personality preferences clearly.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mark. I'm not sure how well I crushed it, but I'm just going by my own observations here as best I can. So thank you. Really appreciate the shout out. And this was fun. And to our listeners tuning in, thank you very much for hanging with us to the end of the episode. And I want to leave on this note here. Typecasting can be tricky. And what you see may not be truly who someone really is. So I want to just remind us all to be careful not to make assumptions. And on that note, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, listeners. I hope you all have a great day, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in. Follow us on social media and your favorite podcast platform.
And please reach out to me on LinkedIn and on my website, atopcareer.com, for more updated content. While the Myers-Briggs and MBTI are trademarks of the Myers-Briggs Foundation, viewpoints expressed here are our own.